The discovery began on a frigid January evening in 2026, when Dr. Elias Thorne, a meticulous historian specializing in forgotten American turn-of-the-century lives, received an unremarkable shipment from a small auction house in rural Maine. Among stacks of yellowed ledgers and cracked leather-bound diaries lay a single, unframed photograph, its edges frayed and corners softly curled from decades of neglect. The image captured the Whitaker family in 1901, posed formally in a photographer's studio against a painted backdrop of draped curtains and faux columns. The mother sat rigid in a high-necked dress of dark wool, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced composure of the era. 2 children flanked her, a boy of perhaps 10, staring directly into the lens with unnerving intensity, and a younger girl clutching a doll whose porcelain face seemed almost too perfect. At the center stood Jeremiah Whitaker, the father, tall and broad-shouldered in a tailored suit, one hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder while the other hung at his side. His expression was calm, almost serene, yet there was something in the set of his jaw, the faint tension around his eyes, that Elias noted immediately as atypical for studio portraits of the time, where subjects were often instructed to appear dignified and composed. At first glance, the photograph appeared ordinary, a relic of middle-class aspiration in an isolated corner of New England. Elias had seen hundreds like it, families documenting their existence before the world changed forever with automobiles and electricity. He placed it under the soft light of his desk lamp, intending to catalog it quickly before moving on to more pressing research. But curiosity, that quiet compulsion that had driven his career for decades, kept him lingering. He scanned the image at high resolution, the modern technology rendering every detail with clinical precision, the faint weave of the mother's lace collar, the scuff marks on the boy's polished shoes, the subtle grain of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. It was during this routine digital enhancement, a slight increase in contrast to bring out faded areas, that the anomaly appeared. An unnatural shadow clung to Jeremiah's form, not cast by any visible light source in the studio, but seeming to emanate from within him. It pooled along his left side, darker than the surrounding sepia tones, almost viscous, as though the photograph itself had absorbed something that refused to be fully captured. Elias adjusted the zoom, heart rate quickening, and the shadow resolved into something more deliberate, elongated tendrils that followed the contours of the father's arm and torso, faint yet unmistakable, like smoke frozen in time. The effect was subtle enough that a casual viewer might dismiss it as a developing flaw or a trick of aging emulsion, but to a trained eye it felt intentional, almost alive. The room around Elias grew quieter, the hum of his computer fan suddenly intrusive. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, telling himself it was nothing, an artifact of poor preservation, perhaps, but the unease settled deeper, a cold certainty that this ordinary family portrait concealed something far from ordinary, something that had waited over a century to be noticed again. Here are some of the vintage family portraits that evoke the era's atmosphere, and examples of the unsettling shadow effect that might appear in such old images. A scholar at work in a dimly lit study, surrounded by the clutter of history, the deeper Elias delved into the Whitaker family's history, the more the photograph's ordinary facade began to crack under the weight of archival fragments and regional lore. Census records from 1900 placed Jeremiah Whitaker, his wife Abigail, and their 2 children in a modest homestead on the outskirts of Eldridge, a tiny logging town in northern Maine where the Androscoggin River carved slow paths through endless forest. The property sat at the very edge of what locals still called the old growth, acres of ancient woodland that had never known an axe, oaks and pines towering so densely that sunlight barely reached the needle-strewn floor even at midday. Maps from the era showed the homestead as an isolated, deliberately placed far from the main roads, as if Jeremiah had chosen seclusion over convenience after fleeing some unnamed trouble in Boston. What truly unsettled Elias were the local accounts preserved in yellowed newspapers and oral histories collected by the Maine Historical Society. In the years following the family's arrival, Eldridge residents spoke of strange occurrences tied to those woods. Hunters reported hearing voices at dusk, soft, insistent murmurs that called out names they recognized as their own, or whispered fragments of conversations long forgotten. Travelers along the back trails claimed the trees themselves seemed to lean in, branches rustling without wind to form words that chilled the blood. Several disappearances were noted between 1898 and 1903, a mill worker who vanished while checking traps, a young girl who wandered off after dark and was never found, all cases closed without explanation, the files stamped with the sheriff's terse note that the woods took what they wanted. The Whitakers themselves rarely appeared in town, buying supplies only once a month, always at twilight, Jeremiah's face drawn and watchful. Elias cross-referenced these tales with a handful of surviving journals from the period. One, kept by a neighboring farmer, described overhearing Abigail confide in the general store that her husband had begun sleeping with the windows shut tight, even in summer, because the voices followed him home. Another entry, from the town doctor, recorded a late-night visit to the homestead where Jeremiah refused examination, insisting the pains in his chest were just echoes. The pattern emerged slowly. The family had sought the isolation of the woods not for peace, but perhaps to contain something that had followed them there. Elias felt the pull strengthen, an almost magnetic draw toward Eldridge itself. He booked a flight north, telling himself it was purely academic, yet knowing the questions the photograph raised would not be answered from behind a desk. The woods waited, patient and silent, their secrets woven into the very roots that had cradled the Whitaker home for over a century, ready to share their murmurs with anyone brave, or foolish, enough to listen. Here are some haunting images of the dense, ancient New England woods that surrounded the Whitaker homestead. Examples of the isolated, abandoned homesteads that echo the Whitaker property. And a glimpse into the antique journals that preserved whispers of the past. The kind of small-town general store where locals shared hushed stories over the counter. The pull toward Eldridge proved impossible to ignore, and within days Elias found himself driving the last stretch of snow-dusted backroads under a sky the color of tarnished silver. He parked at the trailhead where maps indicated the old Whitaker property once stood, now little more than a faint outline of foundation stones swallowed by undergrowth. The air was sharp with pine and the metallic bite of impending snow. The forest loomed ahead, branches heavy and black against the fading light of late afternoon. Elias had come prepared with a digital recorder, notebook, and a scanned photograph on his tablet, but as he stepped onto the narrow path that led toward the wood's edge, a profound stillness settled over everything, as though the trees were holding their breath. He walked slowly, boots crunching on frozen leaves, until the path narrowed and the canopy closed overhead. The light dimmed to a twilight murk, even though the sun had not yet fully set. Elias paused at what felt like the boundary, a line where the open field gave way to deeper shadow. He raised the recorder, intending to note the silence for his log, but instead he heard it, faint at first, like wind through distant reeds, then clearer, voices. Not imagined, not the rustle of branches, but actual words, soft and overlapping, murmuring in a cadence that echoed the fragments from the century-old journals he had pored over. Names drifted on the air, Jeremiah, Abigail, little names he recognized from the census, mingled with pleas, warnings, and something deeper, almost pleading, as though the speakers were trapped just beyond reach. His pulse quickened. He played back the recorder, half expecting empty static, but the voices were there, captured in digital clarity, the same insistent whispers he now heard live in the open air. The descriptions matched perfectly. The journals had spoken of voices that rose at dusk, calling from within the trees, never quite loud enough to pinpoint, always retreating when pursued. Elias felt the same pull the Whitakers must have experienced, a compulsion to step closer, to listen harder. He stood motionless, the cold seeping through his coat, as the murmurs grew more coherent, fragments of conversation, a child's laugh cut short, a man's low warning to stay inside. The line between past and present blurred. These were not echoes of memory but something alive, persistent, as if the woods had recorded the family's final days and now replayed them for anyone who dared return. Here are haunting views of the dense, foggy New England woods at dusk that capture the eerie atmosphere Elias encountered. Abandoned paths winding into the misty darkness, much like the trail Elias followed. A lone figure at the forest's edge, standing in the gathering twilight. And antique journals open to pages filled with notes about the mysterious voices. The unsettling sensation of listening intently to faint, otherworldly sounds in the dim light, the magnification revealed what no casual glance could have detected, faint, deliberate lines etched into the skin of Jeremiah Whitaker's left palm, visible only after Elias pushed the digital contrast to its limits and applied a subtle infrared filter simulation. The markings were not random scars from labor or accident, they formed a precise, angular pattern, interlocking strokes that curved into hooks and sharp angles, reminiscent of symbols that Elias had encountered only in obscure academic texts on pre-Christian European folklore. He cross-referenced them immediately against digitized collections of ancient runic alphabets, pausing when the closest match appeared in fragments of lost North Germanic inscriptions, runes said to have been forbidden even among the Old Norse practitioners because they invoked forces that bound rather than merely spoke. These were not the common Elder Futhark letters found on Viking stones, they belonged to a rarer, more sinister subset documented in a handful of 19th-century occult compendiums, symbols whispered to have been used in pacts with entities dwelling in liminal spaces, places where the veil between worlds thinned. Elias felt a prickle along his neck as he overlaid the photo's details with illustrations from those dusty volumes. The central glyph matched a rune meaning, binding, or silencing, flanked by others denoting death, voice, and eternity. The arrangement suggested a deliberate inscription, self-inflicted perhaps, the skin raised slightly as if the cuts had been recent when the photograph was taken, then carefully concealed beneath the studio's soft lighting. Further research into regional folklore uncovered references to such marks in Maine's backcountry legends, tales of settlers who, facing crop failures, childbed fevers, or relentless bad luck, ventured into the old growth to bargain with what the locals called, the listeners, unseen presences said to trade favors for silence. The price was often a vow of quiet, a life spent suppressing one's own voice and those of others, lest the bargain unravel and the voices return in force. Jeremiah's family had arrived in Eldridge during a particularly harsh winter following reports of a mill fire that claimed several lives, including close kin. The timing aligned too neatly with the emergence of these symbols. The father's calm gaze in the portrait now seemed less serene and more resigned, the hand on his son's shoulder not protective but anchoring, as though to steady himself against an internal storm. Elias traced the lines on his own palm in the lamplight, imagining the sting of the knife, the blood that would have welled before being wiped away, the whispered incantation that sealed the pact. The symbols pulsed faintly in his mind's eye, ancient and hungry, etched not just into flesh but into the very emulsion of the photograph, waiting for someone to look closely enough to awaken them once more. Here are eerie close-ups of old photographs revealing hidden or unsettling markings on hands and skin. Examples of ancient forbidden runes and carved symbols from dark folklore. Mystical visions of glowing runes in misty, ancient woods. A week after his unsettling visit to the wood's edge, Elias received an unexpected email from a woman named Clara Whitaker, a great-grandniece of Jeremiah who had traced the family photograph through public genealogy forums. She lived in a quiet suburb outside Portland, surrounded by boxes of inherited relics she had never fully unpacked. When Elias arrived at her home one overcast afternoon, Clara greeted him with a wary politeness, her eyes shadowed by the same haunted quality he had seen in the century-old portrait. She led him to a small study where artifacts lay spread across a table, a tarnished silver locket containing a faded lock of hair, a brittle journal with pages half-torn, and a small wooden box etched with the same angular runes Elias had discovered on Jeremiah's palm. Clara spoke in measured tones, recounting fragmented memories passed down through generations, whispers of a grandfather who rarely spoke of his father, only to warn that certain questions should remain buried. She opened the journal, its entries in Jeremiah's precise hand detailing a desperate winter in 1900 when illness ravaged the family, claiming 2 infants before the voices began. The woods, he wrote, offered a bargain: silence the cries of the living and the dead, bind the restless entity that fed on sound and sorrow, and in exchange, the remaining children would live. The pact required Jeremiah to carve the symbols into his own flesh, to become the vessel that muted the chorus of the lost. Clara's voice trembled as she read the final entry, dated just days before the 1901 photograph. The voices are quiet now, but they wait beneath the roots. If ever disturbed, they will call again, louder, hungrier. That night, driven by a compulsion neither could fully explain, Elias and Clara returned to the remnants of the old homestead under cover of darkness. Flashlights cut narrow paths through the mist-shrouded trees as they followed a barely visible trail deeper into the old growth. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, ancient. The voices returned, no longer faint murmurs but coherent pleas rising from the ground, names, accusations, desperate bargains echoing in stereo around them. Clara froze when the beams revealed a low mound near the foundation stones, roots twisting like veins over disturbed soil. Kneeling, they uncovered a shallow depression where the earth had been recently shifted, as though something beneath had stirred at the sound of their footsteps. The entity, whatever it was, an ancient presence tied to the land, a collector of silenced griefs, had been awakened by the renewed attention to the photograph, the symbols, the old promises. Elias felt the weight of it pressing in, the air itself vibrating with anticipation, as the voices coalesced into a single, insistent chorus that now included his own name among the called. Here are glimpses of descendants uncovering family artifacts in dimly lit rooms, evoking Clara's haunted inheritance. Eerie nighttime expeditions into misty, flashlight-lit forests that mirror the tense journey Elias and Clara undertook. Visions of something ancient and shadowy stirring beneath the forest floor, roots and mist entwining around a buried presence. The chilling moment of hearing one's own name whispered from the darkness amid looming trees, the confrontation unfolded in the heart of the old growth, where the flashlight beams trembled in Elias's shaking hand and Clara's breath came in shallow bursts. They had dug into the low mound near the crumbled foundation stones, fingers numb from cold and fear, until the earth gave way to reveal a circle of jagged stones arranged in the same forbidden rune pattern that marked Jeremiah's palm. At the center lay a shallow hollow, not empty but filled with a darkness that seemed to drink the light, roots twisted upward like desperate fingers, blackened and pulsing faintly with an unnatural rhythm. The voices, no longer distant whispers, roared around them in a cacophony of overlapping cries, accusations, and bargains, each one sharper than the last, naming sins long buried and promises broken. Elias dropped to his knees, the flashlight clattering against a stone, and in that moment the darkness in the hollow stirred. It rose slowly, not as a solid form but as a coalescing absence, shadows folding into the shape of a vast, ancient presence, limbs of root and void, eyes like voids within voids that fixed on him with recognition. The entity, the listener that Jeremiah had bound with blood and silence, had slumbered for over a century, fed only by the muted griefs it collected. Now, awakened by the renewed probing of the family's secrets, the photograph, the symbols, the voices stirred, it hungered anew. Clara gasped as the air thickened, the temperature plummeting until their breath fogged in violent bursts. The voices coalesced into a single, thunderous demand: payment renewed, silence restored, or the cycle would claim fresh voices. Jeremiah's sacrifice flashed through Elias's mind, the carved runes, the vow to become the dam holding back the flood of sound, the quiet life that ended in isolation so the entity might sleep. Yet the father had known the binding was temporary, the journal's final warning echoed now in the chorus: if disturbed, they call again. Elias realized with sickening clarity that his own investigation had been the disturbance, his questions the key turning in the lock. He tried to speak, to bargain, but the words caught in his throat as the entity reached out, not with touch but with pressure, an invisible weight that pressed against his chest, silencing his breath, stealing the air from his lungs. Clara backed away, but the trees seemed to lean inward, branches knitting together to block retreat. The presence enveloped them both, the voices now intimate, whispering Elias's secrets, his doubts, the small regrets he had never voiced aloud. In that suffocating embrace, he understood the truth: Jeremiah had not defeated the entity, he had merely postponed it, offering himself as the first in an unending chain. The cycle had found its next link. Elias felt the first cut of compulsion, an urge to carve new symbols, to speak no more, to become the vessel that would quiet the chorus once again, at the cost of his own voice, his life, his place in the world. The forest closed in, the darkness rising, and he knew the mystery had not ended, it had only waited, patient as roots, to ensnare the one who looked too closely. Here are intense scenes of heart-pounding confrontation in dark, misty ancient forests at night, where figures face terrifying shadowy entities amid twisted trees. Terrifying awakenings of ancient buried presences in the woods, roots forming monstrous shapes with glowing eyes in the darkness. Chilling moments of realization as a man stands frozen in the forest, pale with horror, surrounded by encroaching darkness and whispering shadows.